Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Bible in 1 Year with the Preacher's Husband. Today we are talking about Leviticus chapter 16, 17, and 18. Now, this begins our discussion, chapter 16, on Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur, or Yom Kippur, as some would say. Now, that is a day of atonement. So the entire chapter 16 is talking about a day of atonement. Now, in God's mercy and grace, He basically provided a day of atonement to the people of Israel. And this was a sacrificial time for them, in which the high priest, or Aaron in this case, would he cleansed the sanctuary, and he made atonement for the sins of the people. Now, in verse 4, right off the bat, it says that the high priest wore the garments of an ordinary priest. Now, at first I thought, well, if this is a day of atonement, wouldn't that be something? That's a significant difference than most of the other sacrifices. The other sacrifices, he's all in his high priest garb. But in this particular day of atonement, which happens once a year, he would only wear the garb of a regular priest. And that was because it indicated him being a humble individual, someone that's humble and someone that's free of pretenses. In other words, not putting himself above others at this point. Now, there was a word that popped up in verse 8, and that word is Azazel. Now, I always go down the rabbit holes when it comes to these words like this, like Azazel. Here in the Christian Standard Bible, Azazel means an uninhabitable place. But when you look at other commentaries, there's three other, assumptions of what this word might have meant other than that. The first one, and the reason why I'm doing this is because this word only exists in chapter 16 of Leviticus. That's it. That's the only place this word was used. One interpretation says, the one carrying away evil, from which we got the term scapegoat. Another view about this word was developed by the rabbis later, who suggested that Azazel means a rough and difficult place. And I can go along with that. And that it represented the goat's destination, that a very difficult place that the goat's about to go to. And that kind of falls true with that uninhabitable place, or a place that's not a place that's livable. Now, the third view, this is where it gets kind of interesting, suggests that the word is the name of a demon that inhabited the desert, which is possible because in the next couple chapters we talk about those forbidden sacrifices and how the Israelites started reverting to pagan ways and were sacrificing goats to a goat demon. So I found that an interesting connection. Later, Jewish interpreters identified Azazel with Azael, whom legend identified as the leader of the fallen angels. I thought that was pretty interesting. Now, this year, Yom Kippur happens on September the 27th in 2020. And typically that celebration, it's a fasting time, it's a time of sacrificing, and a time of atonement for the Jewish people. We get to chapter 16, verse 20 through 28. The author of Hebrews in the New Testament draws a parallel to this ritual that's mentioned here when he affirms that Christ offered himself as a sin offering once and for all. That's Hebrews chapter 10, verse 10. Jesus is also compared to as a scapegoat or a sacrificial lamb. Jesus is a scapegoat because he also suffered outside of the gate so that he might sanctify the people by his own blood. That's Hebrews chapter 13, verse 12. Now, in relationship to Yom Kippur, as a Christian, we celebrate a similar thing with Easter. So Easter is essentially our atonement time where Jesus died for our sins. So that's the link between Easter and Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is typically in late September, early October, but of course we celebrate our Easter during Easter time. From a symbolic perspective, when Jesus died on the cross, the curtain that divided the Holy of Holies from the holy place was torn from top to bottom. That was the veil that was in the middle, kind of in the middle of the tent there, that separated the altar and, of course, the lampstand from the Ark of the Covenant, the Holy of Holies. It tore from top to bottom. That's Matthew 27, verse 51. It's also Mark chapter 15, verse 38, and also Luke chapter 23, verse 45, signaling access to God by all people through Christ's atoning act on our behalf. So that changed from Aaron not being able to go back to the Holy of Holies at any time he wanted. He couldn't. He was limited with when he could go in and how often he could go in. Well, that veil being torn represents that divide being taken away, that we can go to God at any time, any place, anywhere we are, and he is always with us, period. There's no separation time anymore. So we get to chapter 17, and this one he's talking about the forbidden sacrifices. Forbidden sacrifices. See, the Israelites, they came out of Egypt, and there were a lot of different sacrifices and things that they did in Egypt that were pagan rituals, and they began to take some of these with them when they left. Of course, they're still on their Exodus journey, as we're seeing here. But God says, look, don't do this anymore. You're going to be bringing your sacrifices to the tent from now on, to the front of the tent to be sacrificed. No longer are you going to go out and offer sacrifice to these goat demons, as they say, that they have prostituted themselves with. So instead of going outside of the camp and sacrificing your lamb or sheep or your goat, all sacrifices had to come to the tent. Now, this chapter 17, this introduces what is known as the holiness code in Leviticus, okay? Chapter 17 through chapter 26, we're going to be working through the holiness code in Leviticus. These are the laws that call the people to live holy lives before a holy God. So if you're into holiness, and how do you define holiness, these are the books in the Old Testament for you to understand the beginnings of where we come from when we are trying to achieve holiness. These are the laws that set that groundwork for achieving holiness. Of course, in the chapter 17, it always says, don't eat blood and don't eat any dead carcasses that you find. Like I said before, I ain't into roadkill, so I ain't going to be no roadkill. I'm good with that. Now, chapter 18, we get into prohibited pagan practices, and this is where that contention comes in our society today, because our society has taken a let's love everybody no matter what outlook, and that's true. There's a lot of truth. We should love everybody, and we shouldn't judge people. That's up to God to judge people, but this sets the framework for what we're supposed to do and what we're not supposed to do, as far as sexual behavior, as far as pagan rituals. Right off the bat, it says, do not follow the practices of the land of Egypt. Do not follow the practices of the land of Egypt, where you used to live, or follow the practices of the land of Canaan, where I am bringing you. You must not follow their customs. It says here in verse 6, you are not to come near any close relative for sexual intercourse. Now, before this, marriage with one's half-sister, like we saw in Genesis chapter 20, verse 12, was not prohibited. Before this covenant that God had with Moses and the Israelite people at Sinai. But this is new. God changed that here. He basically says brother-sister marriages were commonplace in Egypt, Phoenicia, and pre-Islamic Arabia. So that just solidifies what he's saying here. Do not follow the practices of the land of Egypt and where you came from and where you're going, because what they're doing is wrong. So there's a lot of rules in here about incest, and marrying of relatives are not prohibited. Now, even said in verse 16, you are not to have sexual intercourse with your brother's wife. She is your brother's family. Now, John the Baptist even used this law right here to rebuke Herod for marrying his brother's sister, and his brother's wife. His brother's wife. And that was in Matthew chapter 14, verse 4, and Mark chapter 6, verse 18. This law law, though, was only in effect if the brother was alive. So if your brother died, you still could marry your brother's wife, but only if he was dead, not while he was alive. You couldn't take your brother's wife and have intercourse with her. And of course, we get down to verse 22. You are not to sleep with a man as with a woman. This is speaking about homosexuality. It says, it is detestable. Now, homosexuality is clearly prohibited throughout the entire Bible. Chapter 20, verse 13. Romans chapter 1, verse 27. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 9. We've read already about the Sodomites in Genesis chapter 19, verse 5. And the men of Gibeah were destroyed following their homosexual rampage that we're going to see later on in Judges chapter 19 through 22. There is reference after reference after reference to homosexuality being called detestable because it is against God's order of creation and against his laws pertaining to the covenant community. The word occurs 116 times in the Old Testament in context addressing idolatry, magic, even transvestitism, and defective sacrifices, as well as homosexuality. And just like homosexuality, it says here that bestiality was prohibited. So no sex with animals. Now, tomorrow we're going to get into chapters 19, 20, and 21 of Leviticus. Again, these are the holiness laws, and we are starting into today. I hope this has touched you. Put something in the comments that stuck out to you if I didn't talk about it. If something was interesting to you and you want to talk about it more and get a little more insight, let's talk about it. Maybe you can teach me something tonight. So hit that like button, that subscribe button, and of course click the little jingle bell so you can get notified the next time I do an upload, which is going to be tomorrow. I will see you tomorrow for another episode of The Bible in 1 Year with the Preacher's Husband. Dun dun dun!